A match struck against black stone. The flame bent the wrong way. It leaned toward the altar instead of away from it. 1,000 vampires held their breath in the same heartbeat. Wax began to climb upward along the candle, drop by slow drop, gathering at the wick instead of falling to the floor. The cathedral bells rang once, though no hand pulled the rope. A woman in a gray servant's tunic stood barefoot at the foot of the throne, her hands shaking, her shoulders bowed under the weight of 1,000 stairs. She did not look up. She did not run. She lit the second candle. Then the third. Each one bent inward. Each one bled upward. The marble beneath her feet grew cold, then colder, then began to glow with a faint blue line. Her name was Myra. She was 21 years old. She did not know what she had just begun. Stay with me on this one. Myra had scrubbed the floors of Castle Virathorn for 8 years. She knew the obsidian halls the way other people knew their own skin. She knew which corner of the west corridor always held a draft, even with every door sealed. She knew the long bench in the kitchen, where the cooks left scraps for her if they remembered. She knew the back stair that led down to the servant cells, the one with the loose stone on the 7th step. She had counted that step every night for 8 years. She had been brought to the castle when she was 13. A magistrate had handed her over at the gate. He had said only one word to the steward. "Cursed." The steward had taken her in without asking why. The scar on her face was pale blue. It traced down from her left temple, across her cheekbone, and ended at the corner of her jaw. It had been there since the morning she was found in a snowbank outside her village. The frost had not killed her. The frost had marked her. The village priest had called it a curse. The villagers had agreed. Her mother had wept and tied a cloth bundle to her shoulder and walked her to the magistrate. The magistrate had walked her to the castle. That had been the last walk Myra had taken outside Castle Virathorn. The vampires of the castle did not look at her. Some of them were kind in a distant, formal way. The head housekeeper, a pale woman named Lysen, gave her woolen socks when the winter came. The kitchen master, a broad man named Orvin who had not eaten in 100 years, sometimes asked her if she had slept. But none of them looked at the scar. None of them asked. The scar was something you noticed once and then trained yourself to never see again. Myra had learned to keep her hair across her face. She had learned to keep her eyes on the floor. She had learned other things, too. She had learned which doors to walk past quickly. She had learned to step out of the way before a noble even rounded the corner, because the boots came first and the voice came after, and by then it was already too late. She had learned that wax was easier to lift if you let it cool first, and harder to lift if you tried to scrape it warm. She had learned that the obsidian of the floors held the cold of the ground beneath the castle, and gave it back into your knees if you knelt on it long enough. She had learned to wrap rags around her knees when she scrubbed. She had learned to keep a second pair of rags dry in her apron, in case the first pair froze. She had learned to bow without bending her neck too far, because a neck bent too far in front of a vampire was an invitation. She had not learned this from anyone. She had learned it the way an animal learns the shape of a fence. She had a small wooden chest at the foot of her cot in the servant cell. In the chest she kept 3 things: a wooden comb with 2 missing teeth, a river stone with a hole worn through the middle of it, which she had carried in her pocket the day she was brought to the castle, and a folded square of cloth that had once been part of her mother's apron. She had not opened the chest in 2 years. She knew exactly what was in it. The knowing was enough. She had heard of the king only twice. Once when she first arrived. Once when the steward had told her the coronation was coming. The king was Caelan Virathorn. He had ruled the vampire realm for 240 years. He had not yet been crowned. The crown belonged to his bloodline by inheritance, but the crowning itself was a millennial rite. It happened once every 1,000 years. The last king had worn the crown for 1,000 years and one day, then walked into the sea. Now it was Kaelin's turn. The whole vampire world had gathered to watch him take it. She had seen him only once, and only at a distance. 2 winters back, she had been carrying a bucket of cold water across the upper gallery, when a tall, pale man in a long black coat had stopped at the far end of the corridor and looked at her. He had not spoken. He had not approached. He had simply looked. She had bowed her head and walked past, and her hands had shaken so badly that water had splashed onto her shoes. She had not known it was the king. She had only learned later, when Lysen had asked her if anyone had stopped her in the gallery that day. Myra had said no. Lysen had nodded and said good, very good, and had given her an extra slice of bread that night. Now she was to walk the full length of the cathedral in his sight, and in the sight of every noble vampire alive, and she was to light the 40 candles of his bloodline with steady hands and silent feet. She had practiced silent feet for 8 years. She had not practiced steady hands. Steady hands were not a thing the cells taught. Myra had not been meant to be in the cathedral that night. She had been meant to scrub the lower kitchens. The order had come down at sunset. Lysen had stood in the doorway of the scullery and read it aloud from a small piece of paper. The servant to light the candles had taken ill. A replacement was needed. The replacement had to have steady hands and silent feet. Myra's hands were not steady. Lysen knew that. But every other servant in the castle had refused. They had heard rumors about the rite. They had heard that to light the 40 ancestral candles wrong was to die before the last one was struck. Lysen had looked at Myra, and her eyes had been gentle and afraid. "I am sorry, child," she had said. "There is no one else. You will be safe. You will only light them in order. You will only walk down the nave. You will not be touched." Myra had nodded. She had not spoken. She had been given a tray. On the tray was a single long match made of bone. She had been told to light the first candle at the altar end of the cathedral and walk backward to the great doors. She had been told this twice. She had repeated it twice. She had walked into the cathedral with the tray held in both hands, and her bare feet had been cold against the obsidian. 1,000 vampires had turned their heads to look at her at once. The sound of all those silken collars turning had been like wind through dry leaves. She had almost dropped the tray. She had not dropped it. She had walked the full length of the nave to the altar, and there she had stopped, and there she had remembered nothing she had been told. The instructions had vanished from her mind, the way breath vanishes from a cold window. She had stood at the altar with the long bone match in her hand, and stared at the row of 40 unlit candles stretching back toward the great doors. The candles at the altar end were small and slender. The candles at the door end were tall and thick, their wax yellowed with age. She had not remembered which end to start. She had only known that the candle nearest her was small, and that small things were begun first. She had touched the bone match to it. The flame had bent inward toward the altar. The wax had begun to bleed upward. Somewhere very far away, a single bell had rung. She had not understood. She had only lit the next one. And the next. The bells had begun to ring in slow procession. The vampires in the pews had begun to shift in their seats. A whisper had moved from row to row like a flame moving along a wick. She had not heard it. She had heard only her own breath and the small wet sound of wax pulling upward against gravity. She had lit the 10th candle. The floor beneath her had grown cold. She had lit the 20th. The cold had turned to a glow. She had lit the 30th, and now she stood beneath the eyes of every noble house of the vampire realm, and the floor beneath her bare feet was burning blue, and she did not know why. The 31st candle bent toward her hand. She lit it. The 32nd. The 33rd. Each one stranger than the last. The flames did not flicker. They held perfectly still, leaning inward like creatures listening. The wax climbed up the sides of the candles in slow, deliberate veins and gathered at the top in trembling beads. Somewhere in the gathered crowd, a woman began to weep without sound. Somewhere else, a man stood up. A second man pulled him back down. Myra saw none of it. She saw only the long line of candles still waiting for her at the far end of the nave. She walked backward. She had been told to walk backward. She had remembered that one thing. The blue sigil under her feet grew brighter with every step. It traced itself outward in slow lines, branching like frost on a window pane. It was not painted. It was not carved. It was rising from inside the obsidian itself. Myra lit the 35th candle. A noblewoman in a high-collared gown rose from her seat and pressed her hand to her mouth. Myra lit the 36th. A row of older vampires in white robes leaned forward as one. Myra lit the 37th. The bells overhead were now ringing in a pattern. Not a procession. A song. A song that no one alive had heard, and yet half the cathedral seemed to recognize. Lips moved in silent recital. Eyes filled with something that was not fear and was not joy, and was something older than both. The king had not moved. Caelan Virathorn sat on the obsidian throne at the altar end of the nave, and his pale hands rested on the arms of the throne, and his black eyes followed Myra without blinking. He had not been told what to expect. He had been told only that the rite would proceed in the ancient way. He had been told the candles would be lit in the ancient order. The ancient order was forward, from the eldest to the youngest, from the doors to the altar. Myra had reversed it. Myra had lit the youngest first and was walking back toward the eldest. No living vampire had ever seen this. No living vampire had ever been allowed to. She lit the 38th candle. The cathedral fell silent. Even the bells held their breath. She lit the 39th. She stood now within arm's reach of the great doors, the last and oldest candle towering before her, its wax black with the slow patience of 1,000 years. She raised the bone match. Her hand was no longer shaking. Something inside her had grown very still. She did not understand what she was doing. She only knew that she could not stop. The match touched the wick of the 40th candle. The cathedral floor split open beneath her feet. It split without sound. A line of light ran from where she stood all the way down the nave to the foot of the throne. The line widened into a sigil shaped like an 8-pointed star, and the star burned cold blue, and within the star a second sigil rose, and within that a third. Myra looked down at her own feet and saw that the scar on her face was no longer the only mark she carried. Frost-blue lines were rising along her arms, climbing out from beneath her sleeves, branching across her collarbones, weaving themselves into the same pattern that burned in the floor. She lifted her hands and stared at them. They did not hurt. They did not burn. They glowed. A voice spoke in the cathedral. It was old and dry and came from no living throat. It said 3 words in a language that had not been spoken aloud since the founding of the bloodline. Half the cathedral understood. Half did not. The half that understood fell to their knees. The half that did not understood enough to draw silver. And then it was very quiet. And then Caelan Virathorn rose from the obsidian throne. He stepped down from the dais, one slow step at a time. He walked the length of the nave between the 2 halves of his court, the kneeling and the armed, and he did not look at either of them. He looked only at her. He stopped 3 paces from her and stood very still. "You lit them backward," he said. His voice was low and even, and somehow not surprised. "I did not know," she said. "I know you did not know," he said. "That is why I am sure." She did not understand. She did not say so. She only stood beneath the burning sigil and felt the cathedral hold its breath. Kalen Virethorn looked at her face for a long moment. He looked at the pale blue scar. He looked at the new marks rising along her arms. He looked at her bare feet on the cold, burning floor. Then he lifted his hands to his own brow. He took the coronation crown from his head. He held it in both hands. And the king of the vampire realm, on the night of his 1,000-year crowning, knelt down before a servant. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button. You will want to be here for what happens next. He did not place the crown on her head. That is the thing they would later argue about for centuries. He could have. The crown was his to give. By every law of the bloodline, by every right of the throne, he could have lifted that black iron circlet and set it upon her brow and ended the question in a single motion. He did not. He knelt before her on one knee, and he lowered the crown until it rested on the obsidian floor at her bare feet, and then he lifted his eyes to hers. The cathedral was so silent that she could hear the small, dry sound of his coat brushing against the stone. "You are the one we lost," he said. 400 years ago. The prophesied queen. The one whose name was burned out of every book. The pact of unmade crowns answers only to your blood. The reverse flame answers only to your hand. You have called both. They have come. He paused. His voice did not change, but his throat moved. "I've waited 240 years for the moment that would tell me what to do," he said. "The moment has come. The crown is yours. You may set it upon my head. You may set it upon your own. You may leave it on the floor and walk out of this cathedral and never return. I will not stop you. None of us will stop you." Myra did not speak. She could not. Her mouth would not move. She looked at the crown. She looked at Kalen. She looked past him at the cathedral. She saw the kneeling half of the court, their foreheads pressed to the obsidian, their hands open at their sides. She saw the armed half, their silver blades half drawn, their eyes burning with a fury that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the throne that had bent before her. She saw the candles, all 40 of them, burning in their wrong order and bleeding their wax upward into the air. She saw the bells overhead still trembling without ringers. She saw a world that had been built and held and ruled for 1,000 years, and she saw it standing on the edge of a single answer that she did not know how to give. She thought of her mother. She thought of the cloth bundle tied to her shoulder. She thought of the magistrate at the gate. She thought of the 8 years of scrubbing wax from these very floors. She thought of Lysen saying, "You will be safe, you will not be touched." She thought of the village priest calling her cursed. She thought of every night she had lain on a thin straw mattress in a servant cell and listened to the loose stone on the 7th step of the back stair settle as the castle breathed. She had been a girl who had been thrown away. She had become a woman who scrubbed floors. She had walked into a cathedral with a bone match in her hand. A noble in the armed half of the court took one step forward. His silver blade rasped fully clear of its scabbard. Another noble across the aisle in the kneeling half rose silently to her feet and turned to face him. The cathedral was 3 breaths away from civil war. Myra saw it. She saw exactly what the next minute would look like if she did nothing. She saw blood on the obsidian. She saw fire in the pews. She saw the cathedral she had scrubbed for 8 years burning around her, with the bells still ringing overhead. And then she saw something else. She saw that every face in the cathedral, kneeling or armed, was looking at her hands. Not at Kalen. Not at the crown. Her hands. She bent down. She did not pick up the crown. She picked up the bone match. It had fallen from her fingers when the floor split open, and it lay now beside the crown, blackened and small. She lifted it between her thumb and forefinger and turned to face the cathedral. She lifted the match above her head. The flames in all 40 candles bent toward it at once, as though the match still held the original fire, and perhaps it did. She spoke. Her voice was small in the great vaulted space. But every vampire in the cathedral heard her. "I will not crown him," she said. "Not tonight." The armed half of the court began to smile. They had won. "I will not crown myself," she said. The kneeling half lifted their faces, confused. "I will not burn this realm," she said. Now neither side understood. Kaelin, still on one knee at her feet, looked up at her with a stillness that was almost a smile. She turned slowly in place beneath the burning sigil. She let every house, every noble, every blade, every bowed head see her face. She lowered the bone match toward the 40th candle. She held it there. She did not let it touch. "I will choose," she said. "I will choose in my own time. None of you will choose for me. Until I choose, the flame holds. Until I choose, the pact waits. Until I choose, the crown stays on this floor. No one lifts it. No one carries it. Not him. Not me. Not you. We will live, all of us, in the question. And the first house that draws a single drop of blood over my answer will answer to me when I give it." The armed half lowered their blades, slowly, one by one. They did not sheathe them. They lowered them. The kneeling half remained kneeling. Kaelin did not rise. He lowered his head until his brow nearly touched the crown at her feet. Then in the silence, the wax in all 40 candles paused in its slow upward climb. It hung there in the air, motionless like rain that had forgotten how to fall. And the bells overhead rang once more softly and were still. She did not sleep in the servant cells that night. She did not sleep in the kitchens. She did not sleep at all. She walked, instead, the full length of Castle Virathorn from the cathedral nave to the high east tower, and the castle parted before her without her asking. Doors opened that had been sealed for centuries. Stairs that she had never been allowed to climb stood empty and waiting. A great gray cat that no one had ever seen before walked 3 paces ahead of her the whole way. She did not understand it. She did not stop to. At the top of the east tower, she came to a small round room. It was empty except for a chair by the window. She sat down in the chair. She looked out the window at the slow gray dawn rising over the pine forests beyond the castle wall. She had not seen a dawn from this high in 8 years. She watched it for a long time. The frost-blue marks along her arms had quieted, but had not faded. The scar on her cheek had quieted too. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a word that someone had written on her a long time ago, and that she was only now learning how to read. Kaelin came to the door of the small round room after the sun was fully up. He did not enter. He stood at the threshold with his hands at his sides. He had not slept either, though sleep was not the thing his kind needed. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He looked, she realized, the way she had often looked at the end of a long day of scrubbing, emptied out, and waiting to find out whether the emptiness was a beginning or an end. "The crown," she said. "It is still on the cathedral floor," he said. "No one has touched it. The candles still burn. The bells are silent. The houses have gone to their rooms. Most of them. Some of them have left." He paused. "There will be a war," he said. "Not today. Not next month. Perhaps not for a year. But there will be one. Half of my court believes you are the lost queen returned. Half believes you are a cursed servant who tricked the reverse flame. Both halves cannot be right. Both halves will not live together for long." "I know," she said. "I would have placed it on your head," he said. "Last night. I would have. I know, she said. That is why I did not let you. He looked at her. He did not ask her what she meant. He seemed to understand. He stood at the threshold a while longer. Then he said, very quietly, "May I sit?" She nodded. He came into the small round room and sat on the floor beside her chair. He did not touch her. He looked out the window at the pine forests. They sat that way as the morning grew. After a long time she spoke. "I do not remember my mother's face," she said. "I do not remember my own," he said. There was a long silence. The dawn light moved slowly across the floor of the small round room. A bird called somewhere in the pine forest below, and then a second bird answered. Myra had not heard birds in 8 years. The cells had no windows. The kitchens had no windows. The corridors she had scrubbed had no windows. The cathedral had windows, but they were colored glass, and the light that came through them had never sounded like a bird. "I had a stone," she said. "A river stone with a hole through the middle of it. I carried it in my pocket the day I was brought here. I still have it. It is in a wooden chest at the foot of my cot. I would like to bring it up here." "You may bring whatever you want," he said. "The tower is yours." She nodded. She did not move yet. She was not ready to walk back down through the castle. Not while the candles still burned in their wrong order. Not while the crown still lay on the obsidian floor. Not while the houses were riding back to their lands with the news. She would go down later. She would bring up the chest. She would set the river stone on the windowsill, where it would catch the morning sun. She turned her head and looked at him. The light from the window touched the side of his face, and for the first time she saw, just under his eye, the faint trace of a scar she had never noticed before. It was pale blue. It was very small. It was the same color as the frost on her cheek. "How long?" she said. "Since I was made," he said. "I was not born this way. None of us were. There was a girl once who marked us all. The story said she vanished. The story said she would come back." He looked at her. "The stories did not say what we should do if she came back as a stranger who did not remember us." She thought about that for a long time. She watched the dawn fill the pine forests with light. She thought about the loose stone on the 7th step. She thought about Lysen, who had given her woolen socks. She thought about Orvin, the kitchen master, who had asked her if she had slept. She thought about the magistrate at the gate, who had said only one word. "I do not know if I am her," she said. "I do not know either," he said. "But the flames came," she said. "Yes," he said. "The flames came." She nodded slowly. She lifted one of her hands and looked at the pale blue lines along her wrist. They did not glow now. They simply were. She lowered her hand and rested it on the arm of the chair. She did not put it on his shoulder. He did not ask her to. "I will stay," she said. "For now. I will not crown you. I will not crown myself. I will stay in this castle and I will learn what I am, and when I know, I will tell you. Until then, I am still Myra. I am still the servant who lit the candles. Do not call me anything else. Not in front of your court. Not in private. Not even to yourself." He bowed his head. "As you say," he said. "And the crown," she said. "It will stay where you left it," he said. "On the cathedral floor. Until you choose." She nodded once. She turned her face back to the window. The pine forests were bright now with the slow May sun. Somewhere far below them in the cathedral, the 40 candles still burned in their wrong order, the wax still climbing upward in slow, patient veins, the bells still and silent above. Somewhere far below that, the obsidian floor still held the cold blue sigil, faint now in the daylight, but unbroken. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, The houses of the vampire realm were riding back to their own lands with the news, and the news would split kingdoms before the year was out. And Myra knew this, and Kaelin knew it, and neither of them moved. A great gray cat walked into the small round room and curled itself at Myra's feet. She looked down at it. She did not know whose cat it was. She suspected now that it might be hers. She rested her hand on its head. It closed its eyes. Kaelin, on the floor beside her chair, closed his too. He had not closed his eyes in the presence of another living thing in 240 years. She watched him for a moment. Then she turned her face back to the window, and she watched the morning, and she waited for herself to know what she was. The flames in the cathedral below burned on, patient as memory. The crown on the floor did not move. The realm held its breath. And Myra, the outcast servant, the girl from the snowbank, the woman who had walked backward down the nave with a bone match in her hand, sat in a high tower as the sun rose, and for the first time in her life, no one in the world was telling her where to stand.